Attention! Feu! Même distance! Fumigène! Préparez assaut! Prêt. En avant!
Hello and welcome to Bloke on the Range. This is episode 3 of 3 of Dale's Rifle Grenade Sturmgewehr 57 extravaganza, and we're so glad to have him back, filling our brains with knowledge we didn't know we needed, but we do. We're just expanding the total sum of correct human knowledge in the world, and yeah, so I'm just going to hand the rifle and control to Dale and sit back and enjoy the show.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, welcome to episode 3 already. Just to give some context to people just stumbled across this video, this is part of a 360-degree approach on the M58 rifle grenade. So we already explored the history, the technical aspect, the firing techniques, and now we're going to talk about operationally how the knowledge was applied to troops. So basically, how do you train militiamen who never had experience with weapons in their lives, probably, on destroying tanks and dealing with infantry in extended ranges. So this is the topic of today's video, training and doctrine. Now, just before I start, unfortunately, we don't have any battles to analyze. Luckily for Switzerland, it was never involved in any significant type of warfare, at least in this particular aspect.
Thank you, NATO.
Exactly. So it is sad to say that the situations that I will present to you where this rifle grenade may be relevant are purely hypothetical.
They did, however, study both Warsaw Pact and NATO doctrine. The Swiss were neutral, but contrary to popular belief, this doesn't mean pacifist. It doesn't mean not having an army. It means that, it's part of the Constitution. It's as fundamental to the Swiss Constitution as the various amendments to the US Constitution are and the original Constitution, that they don't join warring groups, but they are heavily armed in case of incursion. And it's always been on the principle that whoever invades us first is our enemy. And during World War II, it was clear that the only threat was from Germany and Italy. Mm-hmm. And during the Cold War, it was clear that the threat was from the Warsaw Pact. So just being neutral doesn't mean that you can't recognize who the enemy is. Mm-hmm. Or who the potential enemy is. It's just that officially you can't
say it.
You can't say Warsaw Pact's the enemy, even though it's absolutely clear from the training materials, the way Op 4 were played in training materials. It's quite obvious that they're Warsaw Pact, but officially this was not. Complicated subject. Anyway,
let's get right into it. So today's plan. We're going to go through this very simple and linearly. We're going to talk about the training equipment that was available, anything else that is ancillary to the rifle grenade, such as targets, moving targets, all the different stuff. Next, the training principles, so that these emanated during the 70s. If you watch the previous videos, you can understand. Basically, how do we introduce the militiaman to this particular system? Next, training program examples. The type of training and the duration is basically up to the instructor's creativity. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. And then finally, we're going to study some case studies of the rifle grenade in field use. Now, static targets. Now, these are especially useful for anti-tank rifle grenade use. There are a whole bunch of different versions. You have, of course, physical, actual tank targets. These are Panzerjäger G13s, which are essentially Czechoslovakian Hetzers, basically speaking. Switzerland adopted these in the 60s as tank destroyers and basically replaced them in the 70s. These were commonly used as tank targets. You can see both in this excerpt from a film in the 70s and this from 1983 in Colombier. And of course, you had varieties of different netting, frames, target areas designated by tires, for example, right here. The purpose is the same, to kind of simulate the bulk of a tank, which is basically 2 by 2 meters. at a certain distance. So however you achieve that goal is really up to what material was available and what is the image you're trying to convey to the troops you're training. Now, what is really interesting, in my opinion, that's a bit of an understudied topic, is the so-called Panzerattrappe, or essentially fake tank targets. These are extremely fascinating vehicles, and Switzerland underwent several of these vehicles throughout the years after the Second World War. And first, before I start, I want to personally thank Chris Zimmerli for sharing all this incredible information. He's a real expert on Swiss vehicles. He runs the wheelsandtracks.com blog, and it's really incredible stuff. And I want to thank him before I start because some of the information that I'm conveying to you has been directly shared by him. So during the Second World War, Switzerland, during and after the Second World War, Switzerland adopted at least 3 different iterations of target tanks. These were supposed to represent, they called them the Spähwagen, and 2 versions of so-called just regular Kampfpanzers, or standard combat tanks. These are basically either converted from a Dodge WC chassis or a proprietary Miley chassis. This was a company that made agricultural tractors. These did not have any armor. These were skirted with aluminum, essentially, so they're not designed to be actual combat vehicles. And allegedly, they were adopted to kind of show off and to basically fake the fact that Switzerland actually had a lot of armored vehicles, which is interesting.
When it had very, very few in
Basically
World War II.
none. Basically none. So that was an interesting anecdote. Now, of course, initially these vehicles were not intended to be used as target tanks for obvious reasons. I mean, aluminum is not going to last very long. But when the Model 44 rifle grenade was introduced, it was deemed interesting to at least adapt some of the vehicles. Now, initially they noticed that the Model 44 practice grenade, which was steel capped, left very nasty dents. And because these were extremely expensive vehicles, I think they costed 16,000 francs of 1940s money, absolutely crazy amount of money. You can understand it's not to their interest to ding these up in no time. And so a number of these were converted by adding a wooden armor on the side, and these were field replaceable. And this therefore constituted the target tank for both the M58 rifle grenade and the UG50 subcaliber training rocket. So very interesting stuff. After the Second World War, around 1948, 1949, it was deemed interesting to kind of replace these aging target tanks and to adopt kind of a unified model, the so-called MOWAG Panzerattrappe. It was delivered by default with, I believe, 10mm steel armor. So it was designed to be somewhat more resistant to projectiles. There are 2 variations. You can see this particular version here has a relatively small window. This one seems to be a later version with a bigger kind of grate, so to speak. Now, you can notice that these had a fake gun. What I forgot to mention before is that the previous Dodge and Miley Panzerattrappes had what they called a Maschinengewehr Markiergerät. It's basically just a megaphone that fired blanks, and it kind of simulated the sound of machine gun fire. At the same time, they also had a, what do you call this, the Raketenleuchtpistole?
Signal pistol.
Exactly, signal pistol that fired a special case, a special cartridge. It basically provided a puff of smoke and a bit of flash to simulate the main gun firing. Now, I'm actually not sure if the MOWAG Panzerattrappe also has these arrangements. Needs to be verified. But these vehicles are relatively simple. They were 4x4 petrol engine, and these were commonly used. Now, what is interesting is how these were issued. What I understood is that these were affected to a particular unit or detachment based in Thun. So essentially, if you were the exercise director and you wanted to use these for mobile target use, you have to call them up, and they physically drove to your Schießplatz to actually use these target tanks. This proved to be a relatively expensive solution. And so these were commonly used, very interesting vehicles. I believe there are a couple of vehicles still surviving at Fulhoyenthal. Pretty impressive stuff. What is interesting is that during the 60s, after the Hungarian Revolution and kind of the tank scare, so to speak, basically Switzerland found itself in a situation where they noticed that they did not have enough target tanks. Because, as I said earlier on, these were all centralized. It was very difficult to dispatch them all around the country. And therefore, there was an effort to develop more target tanks. One of these is the Zielfahrzeug 68. which is essentially a Panzer 68 chassis. Some had prototype tank chassis fitted with a fake turret. These were used for rifle grenades, as you can see right here, with unboosted rifle grenades. Bit questionable practice in my opinion, but also for the later Dragon BB-77 wire-guided missiles. These are relatively robust. Another very interesting vehicle that I found was this Austrian creation called the Zielfahrzeug Schildkröte, or tortoise. During the 60s, Switzerland acquired a certain number of Steyr-Puch Haflingers. Essentially, they're very small, compact, 700 kilo utilitarian vehicles. And I do not know of the exact context, but apparently the same company also proposed the same chassis fitted with kind of a housing, an armored housing, and you could hang nets on them for target use. Very clever stuff. The way this thing works is absolutely crazy. You could either use cloths for rocket launcher subcaliber rounds or nets for rifle grenades. And the way it works is that it was remotely controlled. Absolutely crazy for something at the time. It had a 2-speed gearbox, so essentially you could either do high speed or low speed mode. And the way it works is that, just imagine the vehicle standing there. You would stake a tripod into the ground, and then you have a cable that is attached to this steering bar, so to speak, that is directly connected to the steering mechanism of the vehicle. So essentially, the vehicle is just going round and round the tripod. And of course, you can adjust the radius of travel and therefore get different types of training programs with this particular vehicle. Very clever stuff. And so both the Zielfahrzeug and the Schildkröte, the Zielfahrzeug 68 and the Schildkröte were distributed. I suppose that these were used much more locally, in the sense that each Schießplatz actually had their own, but this needs to be verified. Interesting anecdote, by the way. The very early rifle grenade fins had a very sharp leading edge on both sides. And what they noticed during trials is that they tore right through the nets. Especially, it's a bit embarrassing because the marketing states that these nets were impervious to rifle grenade impacts. Well, they didn't account for the fins. So what they did is that around 1963, 1964, Thun proposed a modification to the fins. This one is actually modified, where they rounded the edges, and this new pattern of fin was introduced for mass production around December of 1964. So when you collect rifle grenades, you might notice that you have two patterns of fins. One is pre-64, one is post-64, specifically modified to accommodate this Schildkröte. How's that for an anecdote? None of the combat ammunition that I know of has been modified, because they're all in production and they're single use. So there's not much point to it. Now you can see right here the target being towed, and this is an excerpt from an original manual showing the tripod being staked into the ground. Next, we're going to talk about the training principles, and these are based off of guidelines that were issued to instructors roughly in the 70s. According to them, the instructor should place as much importance on rifle grenade training as it is in assault rifle GP11 training. So that's a high requirement. Second principle, the first rifle grenade shot, the first impression that the militiaman has on the flying carrots of doom is extremely critical. Basically, the entire career, so to speak, of the militiaman with the system is determined by the first shot. During training sessions, recognition and care is extremely important, because it's a very terrifying technical solution, and therefore it's important to make sure that the men are well taken care of. Fourth is, of course, to train diverse positions, so also prone, kneeling, and standing up. The manual is relatively vague, and the instructor should understand that the system has to be detracted from simply static shooting. It has to be from different positions to be practical. And fifth, we have repeated this several times in the previous videos, intensive but progressive training. Extremely important. And with the portfolio of projectiles available, it is theoretically possible. Now, what's interesting as a kind of a side note is how intensively different types of troops were trained. So in this particular case, it's the Fusilier Gefechtszug, or standard rifleman, and here's the Grenadier Rifleman Company. And you can see the amount of training that the Grenadiers receive in relationship to the standard rifleman. So you also have to understand that the allotted time to each training is important, because rifle grenades is not the only discipline that the standard rifleman is being trained on, but they also have, for example, hand grenades, explosive, mines, traps, all these kind of things. And so it's very difficult to find the time and make sure that the training is done properly. And this depends especially on these particular coefficients. The objectives in direct fire, which is considered as more important, so the actual objectives are much more concrete. Rate of fire 1 shot every 8 seconds. Must respond instantly to a threat. Must be clearly ordered in the sense that you have to make sure that the weapon is well adjusted. And for rifle grenades, self-direction, in the sense a certain independence from orders. Positions, as I said before, standing, prone, kneeling. And in a combat situation, the transition from rifle grenade to GP11 and vice versa is of extreme importance. And finally, hitting. No ranges, that's important because a tank rolling towards you is closing towards you. The distance is constantly changing. You need to account for the hold depending on the range of the target. First hit for known distance, second hit for unknown distance. That's the performance goal. Now, as I mentioned before, the first shot is key. And it's interesting to mention that the training manuals, in this case Panzer Nahbekämpfung or Close Range Anti-Tank Combat, edition 1975, has a whole paragraph listing how to recognize shooters that are crapping their pants before firing rifle grenades. It's extremely valuable knowledge. First, how do you recognize shooter fear? According to the manual, repeated armpit clamping. So the way I illustrate this, basically a lack of confidence in your firing position. Nervous helmet tremor. So in that case, the rifleman is actually shaking, which is not very good. 3, closing of eyes before firing. Self-explanatory. And then, of course, flinching, or abreißen in German.
The last two people do with rifles.
Exactly. So you can imagine that if the rifle shifts, you're not going to hit anything. And if you close your eyes, that's even worse. Mitigating shooter fear. So how do you approach this problem? How do you make sure that the shooters actually hit their targets and overcome their fear? No horror stories or drawn-out theories. That's interesting. As mentioned in the, if you recall, the diary of the soldier who experienced his first rifle grenade shot, there was a certain amount of myth busting to be done. And so I guess that was a responsibility of the instructor to ensure what is real and what is not real about the realities of firing rifle grenades. That is really important. And of course, the more you talk about it, the more people get scared. And so you want to make sure that you transition very quickly to actually firing and not just drawn out theories about, oh, you want to make sure you hold it like this, like that. You want to transition from saying to actually doing. That's important. First, instruct firing without aiming. There's a reason for that. If you actually consciously aim before you fire, your face is very close to the weapon. Psychologically speaking, not ideal. So you would probably instruct riflemen to actually fire this in a more relaxed and natural position just to appreciate the amount of recoil. That's important. Third, optional, using the sling, as I mentioned in previous videos, supporting the sling against your chest to mitigate a bit of the felt recoil. And fourth, prepare iodine and bandages for light scrapes and cuts. So essentially solving the problem immediately rather than have the infantryman agonize for the entire training session and then, you know, talk of horror stories later on. So very interesting, these different theories on how to deal with this particular problem. Now what comes next is extracted from the so-called Bracher report, I'm going to call it that. And they have a very interesting theory on this whole progressive nature of training. In my opinion, it's fascinating stuff. So first of all, you need a clear objective. Achieve a total dispersion of ×2 the mechanical dispersion. Now what the heck does that mean? Mechanical dispersion of the rifle grenade is known as roughly 1 by 1 meter at 100 meters. And you want the shooter to achieve 2 by 2 meters, which is roughly the size of an average Warsaw Pact target. This is the final objective. Phase 1, with unboosted rifle grenades. This is very important. You want to make sure that the fundamentals are solid before you transition to, you know, the hot stuff, essentially speaking. So first, exact aiming at target of known distance. In this case, you can use the so-called Zielbock, which is essentially just an aluminum tripod. You can clamp the weapon into the aluminum tripod, fix the rifle grenade, and use aiming drills. So essentially speaking, you ask the recruit or the militiaman, what is the range of this target and what is my hold, peering over the tripod, stating the correct range. This is the basic fundamental. Phase 2, multiple targets at known distance. 50, 60, 80 meters. Oh, sorry. In this case, unboosted, it would be 15, 20, and 25, for example. This is important because that teaches the militiaman to change his hold depending on the known distance. Extremely important skill. In phase 3, aiming and leading at a moving target. So not only are you changing the range, you also have to account for the speed of the target, how far it is, and how fast is your projectile. And if the militiaman passes these with flying colors, transition to the boosted rifle grenade from the beginning. That's the theory. Now, just to illustrate the point, exact aiming at a target is relatively simple. You can have, for example, the picture of a tank. These kits were actually available for Panzererkennung. For example, different pictures of different tanks in different situations, and also scale models for tank recognition, how to differentiate APCs, towed artillery, self-propelled artillery, and combat tanks, also very important skills. And for example, for phase 2, you can see an example here of different targets with ranges both for unboosted and boosted fire. And then phase 3, you can see, for example, this is an example of a static leading drill. So essentially you have a picture of a tank on the side and a picture of a tank frontally. And the instructor simply states the tank is moving at a reasonable speed at 80 meters. What is the hold you apply? The militiaman obliges and tells, I aim, for example, half a tank in front, for example. Frontally, it would be, I aim on the bottom if the tank is coming towards me. Tank is departing from me, I aim on top, for example. So this is kind of the preliminary drills that are important to solidifying the fundamentals for rifle grenade firing. Now, of course, the instructor can use official training standards, so in that case using a kind of a grading sheet, so to speak, and also have some sort of kind of a benchmark for different manipulations. For example, the Achtung Panzer could be 20 seconds, which is actually very, very long. Preparation for indirect fire, 25 seconds. Reloading in both fire modes, 15 and 10 seconds. Generally speaking, when you have a pool of different candidates, so to speak, for this particular specialty, you start to form what is called an aptitude pyramid. And the Panzernahbekämpfung actually details this aptitude pyramid. Essentially, all rifle grenade shooters, or implied basically all riflemen, need to at least fulfill the goals for no booster charge. And based on a voluntary measure, you can basically call them specialists and basically section them off in different aptitudes from the shortest to the longest range. Now, only the very, very best rifle grenade shooters get to actually experience shooting real combat ammunition. It was actually possible at the time. It's extremely bureaucratic. It requires a very specific area, but those that really showed extremely high aptitude had the privilege of actually experiencing a real anti-tank rifle grenade. If you interview some former militiamen, if they did have this privilege, that means they were pretty badass when they were actually trained on the system. But this aptitude pyramid has more to do than just, a hierarchy. It's also important for the squad leader to know what the aptitude of his men are for particular, tasks. If he knows that shooter A is an 80-meter shooter, the squad leader will be more likely to put him in a position that is favorable for anti-tank defense, for example. So it's very important to have this sort of selection criteria. Now that the men are trained and are considered specialists, it's important to consolidate these skills, and for us studying this particular system to understand where the rifle grenade inserts itself in the kind of general training of the average militiaman. In this particular case, the example here is from Major von Dach's Gefechtstechnik. He actually came up with a whole series of these fascinating books on training theories and combat principles. I highly recommend you to read these. And one of his examples is, for example, a 2-day anti-tank training course. So the rifle grenade kind of inserts itself in this training course. I mean, these, for example, you have disciplines like tank recognition, as I said earlier on, shooting with the rocket launcher and the rifle grenade on both types of targets, obstacles such as mine chains or mine beds, mine planks as they call it, Minenbrett, and of course using the AT mine, explosive tubes, Molotov cocktails, etc., etc. So it's kind of this portfolio of skills in dealing with, you know, a mechanized adversary. Now, what's interesting is also refresher courses. Just a reminder, it was a possibility to do your service basically in a fraction way. So you do your basic training, and then as you come of age, essentially, you do a refresher course every year, correct?
I believe so.
Exactly. So it's a relatively short refresher course, so you have to condense a lot of knowledge to make sure that all these skills are consolidated. So that's one example of a refresher course from Ausbildung und Führung 1977 with modern principles. And you can see the intensive nature of this course over 3 days. And of course, the rifle grenade is going to insert itself in general use of the assault rifle and general combat use and combat formations. For example, aiming drills repetitively, you know, coming up to target, aiming, second stage, when trigger down, coming up, second stage, when trigger down. These kind of drills, for example. And of course, you can see the progressive nature of it. You're going from the individual to kind of a more group use on moving targets. And I didn't really mention indirect fire as much, but interestingly, the refresher course also has these programs for indirect fire specialists, which I remind were 15 men per company. Again, same thing, drills, special equipment, and what's interesting is that for indirect fire, there's a bigger emphasis on group exercises. So essentially the entire squad being engaged as a whole as a support unit. They call these Unterstützungsgruppe, essentially speaking. Now, on a more macro scale, how does the instructor organize a training session well? What's the rational way of doing this? And interestingly, Major Schuet wrote an interesting article in 1983 detailing what his opinions of good training sessions are. So essentially speaking, you have the firing line, you have the so-called resupplied logistics, and in the rear, kind of this secondary logistics, so primary and secondary logistics and the actual firing line. Very interesting stuff. So basically, in the front row, you have this dude waiting to resupply his comrades with rifle grenades, sorry, colleagues with rifle grenades, inappropriate term, ready with grenades that have been controlled by the secondary logistics. So you have one responsible. In the case of reusable rifle grenades, it's important to mention that the tubes have to be in good technical condition. If there's a dent, the tube is unusable. So for example, the responsibility of the dude in secondary logistics is to control that the tube is indeed free to move and with intolerance, and replace fins if broken, if necessary. So it's kind of this rational organization. And also, when you, according to Schuet, when you order material, always order a third more. Because these grenade launching magazines in practice are not very reliable. Because these were core material, not personal issue, and so people didn't really care for them. Feed lips tend to be dented. In fact, this one has a pretty nasty one in it. Therefore, there was a high degree of malfunction with these grenade launching magazines, which is a reason why it's recommended to order much more than actually needed. Now, I talked about introduction, basic training, refresher courses. What's interesting is how these aptitudes were assessed. In the 70s, I think it was an interesting effort. It was deemed interesting to shift to a more reality-based type of exercise, sort of departing from the so-called Feindbild or Kriegsbild, the image of the enemy or the image of war, and then emanating from this image of war, kind of constitute a realistic exercise. And the rifle grenade inserts itself in one of the most important infantry performance norms, so to speak, called the performance norm or performance standard 1. Essentially speaking, it's a combined exercise. Just picture yourself in the situation. You are in a prepared defensive position. Of course, you're taking into account the overhang and the crest, so the enemy cannot shoot further than they can see. And the tanks start popping up. Rocket launchers engage. Tanks keep coming forward. Rocket launchers engage. APCs, which are the vehicles that the NBTs are protecting, start moving forward. Engage rifle grenades. Infantry disembarks. Engage assault rifle. Infantry closes. Use the hand grenade. So it's kind of this general purpose exercise that is the, I don't know if fantasy is the right term, but essentially the perception of the Swiss had on, you know, what is constituted as a general Warsaw Pact mechanized attack. Now, I have some wonderful video to show you of the actual Performance Standard 1 in action, and I think it details it very well.
La disposition de ces cibles représente une situation de combat émanant des normes de performance numéro 1 du service de l'infanterie. Elle montre un groupe de fusiliers renforcés par des tubes roquettes dans la défense contre un adversaire mécanisé. Ce groupe est un élément d'un point d'appui de section. Il combat à partir d'un nid de résistance. Préalablement, l'image réelle de la guerre, base de l'exercice normalisé, est expliquée en détail à la troupe. L'exercice est axé sur la description de l'activité de l'adversaire.
Es tauchen zwei Kampfpanzer auf, fahren in Feuerstellung und schießen Feuerunterstützung. Panzer von vorn, Distanz 200 Meter! Feuer! Frei!
Chars de combat et chars de grenadiers en renfort de l'attaque adverse.
Panzer von Bayern, 180 Meter! Feuer frei!
Deux chars de grenadiers réussissent à progresser jusqu'à 70 mètres devant notre position. Les tireurs de grenades à fusil sont aussi engagés dans la défense anti-chars. Le combat purement d'infanterie commence au moment où les grenadiers quittent leur véhicule.
Aussteigen die Infanterie! Mit Sturmgewehr vernichten!
Quelques grenadiers arrivent à la distance propice au combat rapproché. Ils sont anéantis par des grenades à main. Critiques et discussions. Les collaborateurs du directeur de l'exercice donnent connaissance des résultats de chaque équipe. Le directeur de l'exercice détermine si l'exercice est réussi ou non. Il dégage les conséquences et en tire les conclusions.
Fortschrittsziel 6 Schuss, 6 Treffer. GP11 8 Schuss, 8 Treffer.
Erfüllt! Tragteam links!
Si des normes n'ont pas été atteintes, cela est dû généralement à une manipulation incorrecte des armes. Ces imperfections devraient ressortir nettement de la critique de l'exercice.
Sturmgewehr links. UG 4 Schuss, 1 Treffer. GP11 8 Schuss, 8 Treffer. HG 4 Schuss, 2 Treffer.
UG nicht erfüllt. GP11 erfüllt. HG erfüllt. Der Trupp tritt nochmal an. Trupp übernehmen.
So you saw kind of how the context went. I mean, the rifle grenade is really just a tiny part of the actual defensive effort against a mechanized adversary. And you can see in this particular case, they didn't really hit the targets a lot, which is pretty appropriate for what we're talking about. But I think you got the idea. Essentially speaking, the training was to the highest degree possible reality-based. I think that was the interesting aspect of this particular video. Now for indirect fire as well, they had to come up with some sort of Feindbild or Kriegsbild, and apparently this is supposed to simulate an ambush against an anti-aircraft position. And so basically you would bombard the anti-aircraft position with indirect fire of AP grenades. Relatively terrifying for the enemy, I suppose. And again, here, same idea against mechanized infantry as well. So it's really important to understand that these are all kind of theoretical situations based off propaganda films and some form of intelligence, and so these are to be taken with a grain of salt. But it's interesting to see the intent behind these is that the intent was to make sure that the troops understand why they're being issued these weapons and why they're being taught to use them in this way. So that's really important for effective training. Now, what about combat loadouts? Let's talk about these. These are based off of official manuals for NCOs, which give recommendations on the typical combat loadouts for different roles. The average Sturmgewehr squad in 1965 is constituted of a squad leader, which has no rifle grenades, and a replacement, which doesn't have rifle grenades as well. However, all 5 other riflemen are all equipped with 2 hollow charge anti-tank rifle grenades.
It is inert, don't worry.
I'll try not to drop it though. Now, interestingly, I talked a bit earlier about the concept of the Unterstützungsgruppe, or basically the specialist detachment of indirect fire experts, so essentially a mortar squad. What's interesting is that it's a relatively small squad, but both the riflemen and the squad leader replacement carry up to 6 smoke and anti-personnel rifle grenades. Now you might wonder, how the heck do they carry that many rifle grenades? Well, they put them in this case, M51 or M58 rucksacks. So they're personal rucksacks, and they stuff them with rifle grenades up to the brim and simply take these as their personal ammunition reserve. So you can see that these, when employed effectively, are pretty terrifying. Now what's interesting is the combat loadout change. Now during the 80s, there was a more widespread adoption of the rocket launcher, especially with the adoption of the 5880 pattern, which means that the rocket launcher could be now issued to the squad level. And so the rifle grenade kind of retrograded in importance. You can see that there are only 3 riflemen that are issued with 2 rifle grenades, with the squad leader replacement being one. And of course, now there's more importance with the rocket launcher shooters. Actually, these should be no, not yes. There's a mistake here. Now, again, as I said earlier on, you need to understand that the rifle grenade is only just a small aspect of the overall layers of anti-tank defense that are intended to repel a mechanized attack. But what is interesting is that the higher you go, the less common these weapons are in numerical terms. So essentially, according to the hierarchy in Panzernahbekämpfung, tanks are considered one of the most effective anti-tank methods, which is interesting. Then wire-guided missiles, anti-tank guns, such as in this case the PaK-58 and the PaK-57, rocket launchers, the Model 50 and 58, later 5880, and of course rifle grenades, and finally improvised methods, so really when crap hits the fan, essentially speaking.
Molotov cocktails, grenades bundled together, that sort of thing.
Pretty terrifying. Now, this is something that I found relatively interesting in a pamphlet from 1987 called The 10 Commandments of Anti-Tank Defense. Now, I'm not exactly a military expert, but I found these principles relatively interesting. You should not see further than you can shoot. Basically, the enemy should not be able to fire further than your effective range. So in this particular case, you saw before in the video, there was a definite overhang in the terrain, which means that any supporting tank that is further than your effective range cannot actually see you and fire at you. Very simple principle, but operationally it has to be achieved. To exploit your effective range. With the rifle grenade, your effective range for a skilled infantryman is roughly 80 to 40 meters. This is your actual window of opportunity. Now, 40 meters, the tank covers this distance in roughly a few seconds if he's running at speed. So you want to make sure you understand exactly when to fire, reload, and when to fire again. This is extremely important. 3, ensure the element of surprise, self-explanatory. 4, privilege flanking engagements. Not only is the armor weaker, the tank is a bigger target. 5, use artificial and natural obstacles. Again. 6, ensure high density of fire. So essentially you want to organize your positions in such a way that the defense is layered. So you want to make sure that the effective ranges mesh together over a certain area to ensure the density of fire. Use strong defensive positions, very broad, but to make sure that your positions are solid and well built. Plan for backup positions. Now, One of the characteristics of a average Warsaw Pact mechanized attack is really its inertia. That was really the key to kind of the theoretical success, is to ensure saturation of the area and to make sure that the rhythm of the attack is being maintained. And therefore it's very easy for the defender to be overrun. So you want to make sure that you understand what the backup positions are and what are your options in case you do get overrun. 9. Alerting for tanks must be done in due time. This implies that there is a kind of a listening post or recon post way forward of the actual defensive position. So essentially, this is what triggers the Achtung Panzer signal. So you want to make sure that this is done in due time and that you surprise them, they don't surprise you. 10. Close range anti-tank defense is more than just an emergency measure, and that's really interesting because the rifle grenade falls into this close range AT defense. According to the author, it's important to understand that these improvised methods and the rifle grenades also constitute the density of fire, especially in tight confinements such as forest warfare or urban combat, although Warsaw Pact strategies kind of avoided urban combat altogether because it's extremely risky. It's an extremely risky strategy. But it's interesting to see these 10 commandments and how basically the instructor or the higher level training is done. Let's talk a bit about field use. As I said before, the M58 anti-tank rifle grenade has a muzzle safety of 15 meters. Now, this might seem a bit far to you, but we need to put this number in context. The rocket launcher's muzzle safety is 30 meters. That severely limits how useful it is in close quarters, especially, for example, in urban combat as it is pictured here.
I mean, just to put this in perspective, leaning out of a building to fire down on the most vulnerable part of the tank, you've actually got to be quite a few stories up to be 15 meters up.
That's an excellent point.
Because, I mean, that's the optimal, is to be able to drop something on the back deck of a tank. That's its weakest area. But at 3 meters per story, you've got to be on like the 6th floor, leaning out to be sure that thing's armed.
That's an excellent point, yeah. So actually, the rifle grenade has some advantages than the rocket launcher. First of all, the shorter arming distance. Second, its signature. The rocket launcher produces a huge amount of smoke, flash, and backblast. And talking about backblast, you can actually fire a rifle grenade indoors within tight confined spaces, which is impossible to do or very difficult to do with a rocket launcher. Second, what's important to understand is the M58 rifle grenade has some sort of anti-material use. So in kind of an indirect support type of weapon, it's also quite useful, especially against fortifications. And again, as I mentioned before, pairwise engagement. Because the average hit probability is around 50 to 40%, you want to make sure you get at least one solid hit on target with pairwise engagement, and always with support. Because the thing is, we talked a lot about, you know, the different drills of the rifle grenade, but that doesn't imply that the whole squad is actually involved in this activity. You of course have guys covering you with actual GP11 assault rifle fire, because tanks generally do not just travel alone like you see in this picture. You have a whole column of, you know, motivated infantrymen following it.
And that's the whole infantry armor mix is a characteristic part of the core of Warsaw Pact strategy anyway. So you're always going to have this mix in there once the infantry is debussed from the APCs.
Exactly, that's an excellent point. So I'm going to show you some snazzy drawings. Major von Dach is pretty funny. He also wrote Totale Widerstands, or Total Resistance. And he's very famous for being a very talented sketch artist. And I gotta say, his sketches are really, really nice. So I took the liberty to scan a few from his books and just to show them to you directly. So this situation right here shows you attacking a fortified position with direct fire weapons. So you can see the different portfolio of weapons being applied. And here you can see in the corner the rifle grenade being applied in this particular aspect. So because of the high penetrating power of the M58 warhead, about half a meter of concrete, it is relatively useful against medium to medium heavy fortifications. If you put one in the firing slit, I can guarantee you that it's a pretty good day for the crew inside. Now this right here shows a situation for close range anti-tank defense, kind of an ambush forest type of situation. Just imagine the image. You have, of course, MBTs and APCs in a column because the road is narrow. and you basically force them into a choke point, and that's when you actually kick in with both rocket launcher and rifle grenade. And so the idea being, right here you can see, your rifle grenade crews are basically rotating. One fires, reloads. The other one comes, fires again, reloads. And of course this is all supervised by the squad leader, and don't forget, your rocket launcher is also engaging it at the same time. Now, let's not forget that the APCs behind are filled with infantry, and when they notice that their buddy in front is probably smoking, they're probably going to, come out of their vehicles and try to figure out what the heck is happening. And that is when you convert these rifle grenades to mini mortars and start raining down fragmentation rifle grenades on top of them, while your two rocket launcher dudes are bringing out their own assault rifles and firing GP11 at them. At least that's the theory. Now, what about the anti-personnel grenade? This little puppy right here. It has an interesting uses, especially in kind of this combined counterattack type of situation. Here you can see basically a reinforced squad attacking this position right here, and you can see that they're actively supporting the attack, probably by a secondary squad, with indirect and direct fire with the anti-personnel rifle grenade. Now what is interesting is that you can of course fire salvos. That is what was recommended at the time for maximum effect, but you also need to take into account the preparation time. The time to set up all your equipment, as you have seen in the previous drills, is roughly 30 seconds if you're really in a hurry. So you want to make sure that you understand this preparation time. It's not something you can improvise, or something that's very difficult to improvise. Here in this particular case, supporting an attack on a building by firing through the windows. You can do this a variety of ways, either with your assault rifle, with rocket launcher, with flamethrowers. Yes, Switzerland had these. And of course, putting a rifle grenade into the room and calling it a day. The smoke rifle grenade is tricky to use because you have to take into account one significant factor, which is wind. If you paid attention to the drills in the repeat course, on day 3 they train usage of the smoke grenade and basically how to determine the effective wind on the final effect of the target. This is extremely important. Now in the particular case of the smoke grenade, it is useful to be used against a mechanized adversary, either to mask a position, your own position, or to mark or isolate a target. So in this particular case, Tank 1 is already almost getting blown up by this mine bed right here, but you want to make sure that the dudes in the back don't see it by putting a bit of smoke in front of them just to confuse them a little bit. At least that's the theory. And of course, here to support an attack against a fortified position, your Unterstützungsgruppe comes in play and makes sure to lay smoke all around it to account for the wind. So pretty interesting stuff. Now all of this sounds fantastic in theory. They solved most of the problems, they changed the techniques, so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the rifle grenade has to come to an end sooner or later. Essentially, the main problem was this. The combat ammunition was mostly manufactured in the 1960s. In the particular case of the anti-tank rifle grenade, between 62 to 65 in one production series. And so by 1987, that ammunition was getting very, very old. They didn't age very well. The dud rate was unacceptable. This also coincided with the adoption of the Sturmgewehr 90, which was not at all designed for such heavy rifle grenades, and therefore the interchangeability of this ammunition was a moot point. And therefore, in July of 1987, all rifle grenade training was officially stopped. So any militiaman that did their recruit school after this date will not receive any more rifle grenade training. January 1988, basically they started actually liquidating and recycling, destroying projectiles in inventory. And between 95 to 97, basically all things related to the M58 rifle grenade was wiped out of Army inventory. And also, and this is pretty sad, at least a couple 100,000 of these Sturmgewehr 57s were also recycled, so to speak.
That's recycled on a material basis, as in not recycled through the system. They were shredded.
They were shredded, yeah.
And a lot of them had just been renovated. They just renovated them and then in the shredder. Terrible.
It's pretty crazy. Now, these are some photos that were sent to me via a colleague that found these at the archive, and this shows the deactivation of rifle grenade cartridges. I found these images interesting because the same Manurant machine that used to churn out these cartridges by the thousands per day is now being converted to deactivate them on the same basis. So essentially it's being run in reverse. And you can see right here you have this special tool which peels it open. And I suppose that inside there's a wooden plug extractor that plucks it out. The powder is being separated and the brass is being sifted into another bin. So you can see here being all opened up, here some loose wooden plugs, and here the wood plugs being extracted. Really sad stuff. And then I guess it's a powder funnel of some sort, and here the cases actually go down to a chute for repurposing. So it's kind of this frantic era of destruction, kind of the late 80s and early 90s. So, just to conclude, I think we have reached the end of the M58 rifle grenade series. There's a bit of bonus in the end, small bonus for you who watched this far. I want to reward you and thank you. But just to be clear, I hope you understood the point of this presentation. The point of this presentation is to show you really how much thought has been given in any sort of weapon system, be it tank or anti-tank gun, but just the case of the humble rifle grenade, you can see the amount of work and effort that's being put through it. And you can understand from a more high-level perspective how this played out in Swiss society and Swiss defense overall. And so both the historical and the technical importance, the actual use of hollow charge technology and rocket boosters, these are significant. And of course, the importance of how the rifle grenade inserted itself in Army Reform 1961. This kind of idea of a huge, highly armed and highly prepared force. And the rifle grenade really represents, the rifle grenade with, of course, our Sturmgewehr 57, really show this era relatively well. Now for the bonus. What about the Sturmgewehr 90 and its rifle grenades? I'm just going to go through very quickly through this. What is important to know is that the SIG SG541, which became eventually the Sturmgewehr 90, was fully equipped to fire rifle grenades. In fact, one of its trials was to fire 400 rifle grenades with no loss of accuracy. However, it's important to understand that the Sturmgewehr 90 is only rated for rifle grenades that weigh 500 grams, not 1.16 kilos. The designs that were tested are extremely interesting. I think they probably warrant a separate video by themselves. We just need to do more research. But essentially speaking, the one that attracted the attention of the GRD in the 70s when trials for a small caliber assault rifle started was the Luchaire FN design. Essentially speaking, the bullet trap, these are bullet trap by the way, and the base fuse are both patented by FN, but the warheads were of Luchaire design. Luchaire is a French company that today I think has been absorbed into this conglomeration of French armament industries. The SG541, as you can see right here, was still the M70 combat dress, was extensively trialed with these rifle grenades. And Luchaire submitted at least 4 different versions of these rifle grenades, and the intent to adopt them was clear, at least in the 70s. There was an anti-tank rifle grenade that was rated for 250 millimeters of penetration for a 500-gram projectile. That is excellent.
And just to go back on a point I made ages ago, if you think back to the early videos on these with all the fusing information and everything, you can see how much space the bullet trap takes up.
Yeah, it's crazy the amount of space. Huh?
Which, forget it with these. They could probably have done the simple ones. They could probably have done the smoke and the anti-personnel with them, but the anti-tank, there's just too much going on in there.
It's a very busy projectile.
Very busy
it would have been very, very long. The hollow charge is interesting. I'm just going to go through very quickly, technical speaking, because you can see how low the powder charge volume is. Luchaire noted that this unique geometry of hollow charge was just as effective as a standard hollow charge, and plus it lightened the payload while giving you the same effectiveness. Pretty clever. The other variant was the anti-personnel, anti-vehicle rifle grenade. It's interesting because it's both a combined small hollow charge and fragmentation sleeve. So it's kind of a dual-purpose grenade. In terms of specialist grenades, you have, of course, a smoke grenade and an illuminating grenade. That's pretty interesting. It has basically speaking, you here have a relay. Essentially, when the peak of flight is reached, this ejects this particular assembly, and then a parachute pops out, and the illuminating component starts burning. So it's a relatively interesting design. Now, essentially speaking, there was a problem with these rifle grenades, and there's a reason why they were not adopted, is because, first of all, from an anti-tank perspective, the rifle grenade was already obsolete because armor technology was so good in the 80s and 90s that a small hollow charge, like I showed before, was no longer justifiable. You need almost a meter of penetration to be able to achieve any sort of effectiveness. And thus the rifle grenade would have to become excessively large and cumbersome, which would be impractical. And since the Sturmgewehr 90 is rated only for a certain weight of rifle grenade, the anti-tank part was basically shelved. Now, what about the anti-personnel part? And that's interesting. Basically speaking, rifle grenades were no longer retained when the Sturmgewehr 90 was adopted officially because it was deemed too expensive and time-consuming to develop procedures for indirect fire, sighting devices and whatnot. And so it was deemed to simply kind of try different solutions to kind of fill this gap for an infantry organic explosive weapon. And unfortunately, when the trials were reactivated in the 90s, it was the Gewehr-Aufsatz 97, or the 40mm add-on grenade launcher, that was retained instead because the payload was essentially the same with a rifle grenade. It was more accurate than a rifle grenade. It was less bulky, at least in terms of ammunition, and so there was no reason to retain it for anti-personnel use. And unfortunately, 1997 marks the end of the Swiss's rifle grenade love story. So that marks the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. That is just an incredible amount of material we've gone through today. You've seen this in 3 chunks. We've done this all the way through with a few breaks. And it's just absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for coming and sharing. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks to patrons, of course. The usual stuff. Please engage in the comments and all that, and tell Dale how utterly fantastic he is. This brain has more knowledge about the Sturmgewehr 57 in it than any other living person, simply because what remains from the people from back in the day is fragmented. I mean, Dale has probably condensed it down as far as is humanly possible, unless some more interesting documents turn up here and there, which will just be added to this brain. So thank you for letting us download it. Excellent presentation, as always. And yeah, so thank you all so much, and onwards and upwards. Bye.